It starts the way it always does. A quiet morning, the kind that settles gently over a backyard before the rest of the world wakes up. The feeder sways slightly in the cool air. A thin layer of golden sunlight slips through the trees. Somewhere beyond the fence, a mourning dove calls once, then falls silent. You pour your coffee, walk to the window, and for a moment, everything looks exactly the same. The feeder is busy. Birds are moving. Wings flicker between branches. Tiny shadows cross the lawn. Nothing feels unusual. Not at first. But then you notice something you can't quite explain. The sounds are different. The familiar chatter that usually fills the yard seems thinner somehow. The bright little calls that once bounced from branch to branch are harder to find. The morning still has birds, plenty of them, yet something about it feels strangely empty, as though a few important voices have quietly disappeared from a conversation that used to feel complete. If you're new here, subscribe before you leave, because what you're about to discover may change the way you look at every bird that visits your feeder. And once you see it, you may never unsee it. Outside, the light grows brighter. The feeder continues to fill and empty. Birds arrive. Birds leave. Life appears perfectly normal. But this is where things become interesting, because the changes that reshape a backyard rarely arrive all at once. They arrive slowly, quietly, hidden inside routines so familiar that most people never think to question them. And on mornings like this, when everything seems ordinary, something else may already be unfolding right in front of you. Something patient, something persistent, something that grows a little larger each day while nobody is paying attention. And the strangest part is that the first sign isn't what you see at the feeder, it's what you no longer see there. You have probably experienced something like this yourself. Not all at once, not dramatically. Just a small feeling that appears one morning and then quietly follows you for weeks. You glance out at the feeder while making breakfast. The sunlight lands on the same fence post it always has. The seed level looks fine. There are birds moving through the yard. Everything seems normal, and yet something feels slightly different. You cannot immediately name it. Most people cannot. So they dismiss it. They tell themselves they are imagining things. They get on with their day. But then another morning comes, and another. You begin noticing little absences. A favorite visitor that used to arrive before sunrise no longer appears on the maple branch. A tiny shape that always darted through the shrubs seems harder to find. The familiar rhythm of the yard feels just a little off balance. Not empty, just changed. The strange thing is that these moments rarely feel important when they happen. They feel ordinary, easy to overlook. Like a photograph hanging slightly crooked on a wall. You might walk past it 10 times before realizing something is different. And even then, you cannot quite explain why it bothers you. But that feeling stays, somewhere beneath conscious thought. The natural world has a way of speaking through patterns rather than words, through repetition, through routine, through things that appear every day until the day they do not. And this is where many people begin paying closer attention. Not because they see something unusual, but because they begin sensing that something familiar is quietly fading from view. And what makes this even more interesting is that the reason is often sitting in plain sight the entire time, hidden among the movement, hidden among the wings, hidden inside a scene that still looks perfectly normal. The hidden part is this. Most people assume a feeder is simply a place where birds come to eat, a hanging container, some seed, a few visitors passing through the yard. But if you spend enough mornings watching carefully, another picture begins to emerge. The feeder is not just a food source, it is a meeting point, a map, a quiet system of relationships unfolding in the open air. Long before the first sunlight reaches the lawn, certain birds already know where they will land. They approach from the same trees, use the same fence posts, pause on the same branches. Their movements follow invisible routes that become surprisingly consistent from day to day. That little chickadee that once appeared from the cedar near the back corner, the goldfinch that preferred the wire fence before dropping to the feeder, the nuthatch that always worked its way down the oak trunk before arriving. These details seem small until one day they begin to change. The feeder is still busy. Wings still flash through the morning light. But the familiar patterns are no longer where you expect them to be. Instead, larger shapes begin appearing more often. They gather on the roofline, along the power lines, in clusters near the tallest trees at the edge of the neighborhood. At first, there are only a few, easy to ignore, easy to mistake for ordinary visitors. Yet there is something different about the way they move. They do not arrive one by one. They arrive together. They watch together. They leave together, almost as though they are following a plan invisible to everything around them. And this is where the hidden layer begins. Because what looks like random bird activity from a kitchen window is often something much more organized, a slow shift in the balance of an entire backyard, one that most people never notice until the signs become impossible to miss. What makes this so easy to miss is that the newcomers are not doing anything unusual. They are simply being exactly what they are. If you stand by the window long enough, you begin to notice a pattern. A handful arrives first, then a few more. Then suddenly, the feeder that felt spacious a week ago seems smaller than it used to. Researchers who study bird behavior have long observed something remarkable about these birds. They are highly social, highly observant, and perhaps most importantly, they pay attention to one another. When one discovers a reliable source of food, others often follow. Not eventually, sometimes within days, sometimes within hours. What begins as a small discovery can spread through a local flock with surprising speed. But facts alone do not explain the feeling. The feeling comes from watching the yard itself respond. A bird lands on the feeder, another joins it, then another. The branches above begin to fill. The power line gathers silhouettes against the morning sky. The air feels more crowded somehow, even before the numbers become obvious. There is a quiet confidence to their movements. They rarely seem uncertain, rarely seem hurried. They arrive as though they already know exactly where they are going, and in a way, they do. Studies suggest birds learn from one another constantly, sharing information about food, safety, and successful feeding locations. The feeder is no longer being discovered. It is being remembered, passed along, added to an invisible network of knowledge stretching beyond the boundaries of a single backyard. And this is where the mystery starts to feel real. Because what you are witnessing is not random chance. It is the natural result of intelligence, memory, and social behavior unfolding quietly above your lawn. Yet the most fascinating part is not how they arrive. It is what begins happening to the birds that were already there once they do. This is usually the point where people begin noticing specific absences. Not because they are counting birds, not because they are keeping records, but because certain visitors become part of a morning routine without you realizing it. There was the chickadee that always appeared first, arriving from the cedar tree just after sunrise. The nuthatch that paused upside down on the oak before dropping toward the feeder. The goldfinch that seemed to arrive only when the light turned soft and golden across the yard. You never plan to become attached to them. Most people do not. Yet, something happens when you see the same small life return day after day. Their presence becomes woven into the landscape, like a familiar porch light at the end of a street, like a favorite chair that is always waiting in the same corner of a room. One morning, you notice the chickadee does not appear. The next day, you find yourself looking for it without meaning to. A few days later, you realize you have been scanning the same branch every morning, waiting, hoping. The branch remains empty, and that is when the relationship reveals itself. Not when the bird arrives, but when it does not. Outside the window, the feeder remains active. Wings still flash through the sunlight. Shadows still move across the grass. Yet the yard feels less personal somehow. Less familiar. The little routines that once made the space feel alive are becoming harder to find. Meanwhile, the larger groups continue returning with remarkable consistency. The roofline fills, the feeder fills, the nearby branches fill, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the balance shifts. Not through conflict, not through drama, simply through presence, through repetition, through showing up every day until the landscape begins reshaping itself around them. And the more this happens, the more another question starts to emerge. If a few new arrivals can change the feeling of an entire backyard, what happens when their numbers continue growing week after week? At first, the change measures itself in small moments. A branch that stays empty, a visitor that arrives less often, a morning song that no longer greets the sunrise. But given enough time, those small moments begin connecting together like pieces of a picture slowly coming into focus. By late spring, the yard can feel different even before the first bird lands. You step outside. The air is still cool. Dew rests across the grass. The feeder hangs exactly where it always has. Yet the atmosphere has shifted. The movement overhead is heavier now. Groups gather on rooftops before sunrise. Dark silhouettes line the power lines stretching across the neighborhood. They seem to know something, not in a mystical sense, not as a secret, simply through numbers, through memory, through constant communication. A single backyard is never truly isolated. What happens in one yard influences another, and another. Food sources become known. Routes become established. Habits become traditions passed from flock to flock. This is where many people underestimate what they are seeing. They think they are watching individual birds. In reality, they may be watching a network, a living flow of information moving through the landscape every day. And once that flow begins favoring a particular location, growth often feels surprisingly fast. One week there are a few familiar gatherings. A few weeks later, the feeders seem surrounded from every direction. The sky above the yard feels busier. The branches feel fuller. The quiet spaces between movements become harder to find. What makes it so fascinating is that no single moment announces the transition. There is no clear beginning, no obvious turning point. Just a gradual reshaping of the world outside your window until one morning you look out and realize the yard you are seeing is not quite the same yard you remember. And this raises a deeper question. If the balance has shifted this far already, what exactly happens to the birds that once called this place home when the transformation continues? There is something about a quiet backyard that teaches you to notice patterns. Not immediately, not all at once, but over months and seasons, you begin recognizing that every place has a kind of rhythm. Certain birds arrive with the first pale light of morning. Others appear only when the sun climbs higher above the trees. Some stay through winter. Some vanish with the changing season. Together, they create a balance that feels so natural most people never stop to think about it. Until that balance begins to change. Many people believe that nature speaks in dramatic events. A storm, a migration, a sudden disappearance. But more often, the messages are subtle. A familiar visitor becomes less frequent. A favorite song grows quieter. The spaces between encounters become longer. Something about this feels difficult to ignore because it mirrors experiences far beyond the feeder. Relationships change this way. Communities change this way. Even memories fade this way. Not in a single moment, but through countless small absences that slowly reshape the world around us. Standing at the window, watching the yard evolve, it becomes hard not to reflect on that. The larger gatherings continue arriving with confidence. The feeder remains active. Life continues. Yet the diversity that once made every morning feel unpredictable begins narrowing into something more uniform. Researchers would describe this as a shift in habitat use and resource competition, and they would not be wrong. But there is another layer that many people quietly feel even if they never say it aloud. The feeling that every backyard tells a story about balance, about who belongs, about what happens when one voice becomes louder than all the others. And this is where the story becomes more than birds and seed. Because once you see the pattern clearly, another realization begins taking shape. The future of the yard may depend entirely on whether someone notices what is happening before the silence grows any deeper. One morning, instead of rushing to refill the feeder or wondering what has gone wrong, you simply stand there and watch. The coffee cools slowly in your hand. The early light settles across the grass. A breeze moves through the leaves with a sound so soft it almost disappears into the background. For the first time in a while, you stop looking only at the feeder. You look at the entire yard. The fence posts, the shrubs, the branches where birds once paused before landing, the narrow spaces between movement and silence. And something becomes clear. The yard was never just about feeding birds. It was about creating a place where many different lives could cross paths. A place of variety, of surprise, of small daily encounters that gave each morning its own character. Perhaps that is why the changes felt so personal. Not because a feeder became crowded, but because the feeling of balance slowly drifted away. The realization arrives quietly. Like sunlight, reaching a corner of the yard that has been shaded all morning. Nothing dramatic happens, no sudden revelation, just an understanding that grows a little stronger each time you watch. Nature rarely asks for perfection. It simply responds to patterns, to conditions, to opportunities. Change the conditions, and over time, the pattern begins to change as well. Standing there, listening to the wind move through the trees, it becomes easier to feel hopeful than worried. The story unfolding outside the window is not finished. The branches are still there. The morning light is still there. The feeder still hangs in the same place. And beneath all the movement, beneath all the noise and activity, the possibility of balance remains, waiting quietly, ready to return the moment the yard begins inviting it back. A few weeks later, the mornings begin to feel different again. Not dramatically, not all at once, just enough that you notice it when you step outside with your coffee and pause beneath the same sky you have watched for months. The feeder is still there, moving gently in the breeze. The maple branches still catch the first light of day. But now, something else has returned. A small movement near the fence. A familiar shape on a branch that had been empty for far too long. Then another, and another. The yard does not become perfect. Nature rarely works that way. Yet little by little, the variety begins to reappear. Different songs drift through the morning air. Different wings cross the lawn. The quiet balance that once seemed lost starts finding its way back. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson hidden inside all of this. The natural world is constantly responding, constantly adjusting, constantly reminding us that small changes, repeated over time, shape far more than we realize. Many people believe the most important moments in nature are the dramatic ones, but often it is the subtle shifts that matter most. The branch that is occupied again, the familiar call returning after weeks of silence, the feeling that a place has remembered what it once was. Thank you for staying until the very end of this journey. If you enjoy stories like these, stories that reveal the hidden layers of the world just outside our windows, consider subscribing before you leave, because there are still so many things out there that most of us pass by without ever truly seeing. And perhaps that is the real mystery. Not whether birds change a backyard, but how often a backyard changes us. Somewhere outside tonight, beneath a porch light, beside a quiet feeder, or high in the dark branches of a sleeping tree, another story is already beginning. Maybe it was only birds, but somehow, it never felt like only birds.